You don't go to the civilian cities, you don't attack the civilians, you don't touch the civilians, you don't change their law system, you don't deal with their economics or take their resources. You literally just demilitarize the state. You basically demobilize their army, and the soldiers can go back to being civilians, and the state will be under Muslim security. And that is pretty much what the Islamic armies did. But it should be noted that there was a kingdom, a Christian kingdom, that was right next to the Muslim state for 1,000 years. The kingdom of Abyssinia. No Muslim army ever attacked Abyssinia, despite Abyssinia being right next to the Muslim capital. Muslims were going all the way up to Spain, all the way into Sindh, or where was modern-day India. But Abyssinia, the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, was not touched. There was no fighting between Christians and Muslims of Abyssinia for 1,000 years. And I say 1,000 years because after 1,000 years, there was some of these Ethiopians or Abyssinians, they converted to Islam of their own, and then some of them wanted to basically have their own state within Abyssinia, and that caused a bit of a fight. But that's an internal matter. That's not a Muslim army going to Abyssinia. It's some Abyssinians converting to Islam and then wanting to actually have their own state. That's a different discussion. But the Abyssinians were not attacked, and they were not touched. So we see then that Islam is not about forcing people around the world to be Muslim or to force the Sharia on anyone, and I'll get to proofs of how it does not force the Sharia onto people. But I think the question is, why do you see on TV and on the media that Muslims are depicted as violent all the time? What you see is, you see from Somalia, you see from Iraq, you see from Afghanistan, you see from Palestine, or you see these Muslims with AK-47s waving up in the air and shooting and having their faces covered and so on and so forth. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you what. If Fox News or CNN existed in 1812, they would have shown you Canadians as being violent. They're saying, people, and Americans would be saying, why is it every time I see a Canadian on CNN and Fox News, it's 1812, why do they always seeing fighting us Americans and killing us Americans? Why? Well, that's because you're invading Canada. 1812, they tried to invade Canada, right? And they got kicked out. And no doubt the Americans would have depicted the Canadians as being violent militants. And how dare they resist American soldiers when they when they walk into the land? Thomas Jefferson thought that basically, he said, invading Canada is just marching into it. That's it, just marching. He didn't expect any resistance. But I didn't think it worked out too well. So the same goes for Muslims. Where are these Muslims being violent against American soldiers or British soldiers? Where are they? It's Afghanistan. It's not number 10 Downing Street. It's not in Washington, D.C. It's in Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine. This is Muslims on their own land. Who are they fighting? You know when they say foreign fighters, the problem is foreign fighters. Yes, there is foreign fighters. The American army are foreign fighters. The British army are foreign fighters. They're going into these countries and invading and attacking. And what you're going to get? You're going to get Muslim militias being formed. You know, the Canadians, 1812, you formed your own militia to fight because you didn't have enough soldiers. You formed your own militia. The Muslim armies are not very good at defending the land. They're more good at unfortunately, oppressing some of the people because of a post-colonial situation. But the Muslim people have formed militias to defend themselves. So you can't, these people are terrorists. Well, according to Britain, according to British history, the George Washington is a terrorist and an insurgent. Because he rose up to try to, and kicked out the British who viewed themselves as the legal authority of the colonies. It's a shame he won, because when I went to America, I went to Canada, I just compare. Canadians are so laid back and polite. And I went to America, and it's a little different. Canada's like what America should have been like. I guess I won't be allowed back into America anymore, but there we go. That's the basic situation. No one ever questions that. Where are these people fighting? They're fighting in their own land. But does Islam give no limitations to warfare? So, all right, fine. Islam says you can fight a just war, but is there any limitations? Can you just kill anyone you want or kill people because they're non-Muslim? Or is there any limitations in Muslim warfare? And yes, there is. The Quran says, fight in the cause of God those who fight you, but do not transgress the limits, for God does not love the transgressors. And we see that Caliph Umar Abdul Aziz, and he was a caliph, he's like being a caliph is basically the head political ruler of the Muslim world. And he said, the killing of women and children is included within this, and so are those who are not involved in warfare. So Umar Abdul Aziz, when he's commenting on this verse of the Quran, and he's a caliph, right? He's the leader, the political leader, not spiritually, he's not a pope, but the political leader of the Muslims. And he understood, and Muslims basically view him as a righteous caliph, that he said that transgressing the limits means, if you transgress the limits are the killing of women and children and those who are not involved in warfare. So do not transgress these limits, do not kill women and children, and do not kill those who are not involved in warfare. The Prophet Muhammad, ﷺ, it was reported that basically after a battle, there was a body of a dead woman on the battlefield. It's on a battlefield, a body of a dead woman on the battlefield. And there were people gathered around this, and the Prophet Muhammad heard about this, and he came towards this, this dead body where everyone's gathered around this. And he declared, this woman was not fighting amongst those who were fighting. And he said to the commander of the army, said that do not kill children and do not kill the weak. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was angry that a woman had been killed in a battle. Yes, even on the battlefield. I mean, this was a battlefield, right? Battlefield accidents can happen, but he was angry that a woman was killed on the battlefield. And he forbade that. He forbade the killing of children and the killing of the weak. So how much more so would he have forbidden the killing of people in towns and cities which are not the battlefield? So if the Prophet Muhammad forbade the killing of women, children, and the weak, and those who are not involved in warfare on the battlefield, how much more so has he forbade it, the killing of these people outside of the battlefield? We also hear that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he was advising the Muslim armies, he said, "March in the name of God with the succor of Allah, of God, over the religion and over the religion of the Messenger of God. But kill not the emaciated old, nor the young children, nor the women, and deceive not, and collect the war goods, but do good, show kindness, because God loves that you do good to others." So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is telling the Muslim armies, do good and show kindness, and not to kill, and a whole number of categories which were named basically the weak and those who are not involved in warfare. We see that a famous Islamic scholar, Imam Qurtubi, he said, the fact that someone disbelieves in Islam does not prevent us from being just to this person. And that our dealing with them, if it's in a state of warfare, should only be restricted to fighting or capturing them if they deserve so. But it is not permissible for us to retaliate in the same manner, even if they kill our women and children and cause sorrow to befall us. It is not permissible for us to act likewise with the intention of making them feel grief and sorrow. So even if the enemy you're fighting kills your women and children, you are not allowed to retaliate, killing their women and children to make them feel grief and sorrow. You're not allowed to do this. We also see that the famous Islamic scholar Ibn Kathir, when he was writing a commentary on a verse of the Quran, when he talked about the limits of God, the God said, do not transgress the limits, he said, and let him not exceed limits in the matter of taking life. This means that the hair should not go to extremes in killing the killer, such as mutilating the body or taking revenge on persons other than the killer. So if someone has killed or has committed murder, you do not attack his family or kill anyone else except the person who has basically done the transgression. And of course, you should do it via the court system, if there is courts. So then, who really does justify terrorism? Where does the real justification for terrorism come from? Well, let's have a look at this. In World War I, the Allies, in order to make Germany, Germany had already surrendered, or rather they had already made an armistice, but in order to force certain peace terms, certain terms they wanted the Germans to accept, they starved Germany for 6 months. They blockaded it and starved them of food as civilians for 6 months. And when it was told to Winston Churchill that I think it's enough, let's just stop this, he said, no, wait until they agree to all of our terms. And the people of Germany were suffering so much that they basically, they were eating animals because they didn't have food. This is World War I, and the Germans weren't Nazis. They weren't. This is World War I. There was just a battle between empires, not between Nazis. There was no Nazis at the time. In World War II, the British started strategic bombing of German cities. Did you know that it was the British that started it, not the Germans? The Germans didn't attack London or attack the urban cities. It was the British that started the bombing of civilian cities first. And Hitler was so outraged because Hitler thought that you don't attack civilian cities. Right? You don't do that. He was so outraged that he said, right, we're going to retaliate against Britain. So Britain actually brought the Blitz against itself by starting strategic bombing of cities. And Winston Churchill, he said that the purpose of this was to spread a lively terror amongst the Germans. Interesting. So he said the purpose is to use bombing to spread terror. What does that make someone? I don't know. It'll come to me. Interesting note. People might say, but the Nazis were evil, and sure, of course they were evil. Yes, of course. And they massacred the Jews, and they massacred many other Russians and Polish and so on. Yeah, of course. But the British never fought the Germans because of the Jews. The Neville Chamberlain's ultimatum to Hitler was to get out of Czechoslovakia, not to stop persecuting the Jews. You notice that? No one ever talked about the Jews. Yes, Britain knew what Germany was doing to the Jews, but that wasn't the issue. The issue with Britain was that the Germans would become too powerful by having all this land in Europe. You know, England was always about the balance of power in Europe. That's all that England ever cared about. They didn't care about the Jews. So when people say, well, World War II was a just war, well, yeah, sure. I mean, you know, Nazis were nasty people, and that's true. But if you asked the Mau Mau tribes in Kenya, if you asked them, they wouldn't see a difference between the Nazis and the British because the British had concentration. Do you know who invented the concentration camps? It was the British. In South Africa, in Kenya, and they massacred civilians in these colonial territories. In India as well, they massacred civilians and so on. So the World War II was not a war about justice. It was a war for basically Britain maintaining a balance of power in Europe, like World War I. We see America uses napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam, chemical weapons and flammable weapons against civilians in Vietnam. We see that it used white phosphorus in Fallujah. Israel uses white phosphorus in Gaza against cities. That's basically, white phosphorus. It's flammable. It kind of disperses out. It sets things alight, including skin. And you can't even put it out. Even if you put it into water and you take your arm back out again, it will still be burning your arm. So they use chemical weapons against civilian targets. They support terrorist groups such as the MEK group, which is an anti-Iran group, which America kindly gave its base in Iraq to continue their operations against Iran. If you go to Miami and Florida, you'll find anti-Cuban terrorist groups like Omega 7, Alpha 66, there who are basically terrorists attacking Cuba, but they're given safe haven in America and a base of operations in Miami and Florida. We see that Luis Posada Carriles was basically the anti-Cuban version of Osama bin Laden. He basically bombed an airplane, and he's currently living comfortably in America. And he actually blew up an airplane with people on it, basically, and which is pretty much what we define as terrorism. The CIA funded the Nicaraguan Contras, and so on. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Terrorism is supported when it's done in the name of certain countries' interests. And when it's not done in the name of certain countries' interests, then you are declared to be terrorist and you're made illegal. So unfortunately, the issue is not Islam supporting terrorism, but rather it's the many countries who historically have done terrorist acts against civilians and have supported terrorist groups when it suits their national interest. I mean, just consider when people might say, okay, when we drone strikes or bomb certain town cities, there's collateral damage. It's unfortunate, but this is part of the operation. Just ask a simple question. Okay, when Fallujah was being, bombed with white phosphorus, would they have done the same thing if non-Muslim American citizens had been living in Fallujah? Would they say, let's bomb it to get rid of some of the terrorists? And it doesn't matter about acceptable civilian casualties. No, they wouldn't. The problem is that some civilians are considered to be more important than other civilians. And some civilians are considered to be more acceptable to be killed than or acceptable to be collateral damage, as they call it, than other civilians. And this is the kind of problem that we see. And what you'll see is that some terrorists are celebrated. Some terrorists are celebrities. But they're terrorists, and maybe they had some good intentions, but they're terrorists. And I'll give you a controversial one. A recent person who passed away, Nelson Mandela. It's quite controversial. just a bit. He had his group, the MK, or Spear of the Nation. What did they do? What did his group do? I mean, he was locked in prison for a reason. What was that reason? He was locked in prison for terrorist charges. His group perpetrated bombings against restaurants, cafes, shopping centers, and beachfronts, killing women and many women and children. Also killing, used to assassinate dissidents or assassinate other groups in the Black Liberation Movement, which were against the MK or against the ANC. It was quite a nasty group that he was part of. And when the South African government wanted to let him go for jail early, they said, look, you know what, Nelson Mandela, we'll let you out of jail early if you just tell your group to stop the terrorist attacks. And he goes, no, you stop what you're doing against us, and we'll stop the violence against you. So this is actually the situation of what Nelson Mandela. If Nelson Mandela had been a Muslim, you wouldn't have seen Obama, go to his funeral and take a selfie. Yeah, you see. So it's about perspective. One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. Osama bin Laden is a terrorist, and what he did, what he supported, was wrong. But it's interesting how some terrorists are celebrities, and other terrorists are made to be the bogeyman. But Osama bin Laden, did he commit his terrorism acts based on Islamic teachings? That's the question. Did he justify it by Islam? Well, here's what Osama bin Laden said in 1998 to an ABC reporter. He said, our religion forbids us from killing innocent people such as women and children. He also said in a discussion in 2001, October 21, to an Al Jazeera interview, he said, referring to the Muslim scholars, he says, Muslim scholars say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid. And for proof, they say that the Prophet Muhammad forbade the killing of women and children, and that is true. So here's what Osama bin Laden is saying. It's true. He confirms what the Prophet Muhammad has said. And he continues, it is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet in an authentic tradition, but he believes, Osama bin Laden now believes, that for the forbidding of killing of children and innocents is not set in stone. If disbelievers were to kill our women and children, then we should not feel ashamed to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from killing our women and children. Osama bin Laden is not using Islamic texts to justify his retaliation against the West. He's just using his anger, his personal hatred. He's using that to justify why we should retaliate against the West using the same kind of tactics. So it's not Islam. Osama bin Laden is not saying the Quran gives him the right to kill people. He's just saying that his anger gives him the right to kill people. He even, the Quran basically does not allow you to kill anyone unjustly. The Quran says, if anyone killed a person not in retaliation of murder or to spread mischief in the land, it would be as if he killed all of mankind. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if they had saved the life of all of mankind. In Islam, we don't believe in utilitarianism. You don't believe that you can do some evil to do a greater good. We don't believe in that. We believe that everything you do must be good. It doesn't matter if you think you're doing it for a greater good or a noble goal. Osama bin Laden said that the reason why he did this, the reason why he's doing this, is he hopes that by retaliating against the West would stop attacking Muslim countries and stop killing Muslim women and children. But this is wrong. Because even if what he said was true, even if that would actually be the case, it's still wrong. Because in Islam, we believe that you must do good, even if there is benefit to doing bad. We're not a religion of saying, well, do good if it's convenient. Osama bin Laden also doesn't believe that Islam says we must kill the disbelievers or launch jihad against disbelievers just because they're disbelievers. Even he admits, he says, Bush's claim is that we hate freedom. Let him tell us why we did not strike Sweden, for example. Your security is in your own hands. Each and every state that does not tamper with our security will automatically have assured its own security. So he's basically saying, we don't attack the West because we hate freedom. We attack those countries which attack us. And lastly, and I think this is very interesting, and here's the real place where Osama bin Laden got his doctrines from. Here's the real place where Osama bin Laden is getting his justification for using attacks that kill women and children. He said, America has not been known to differentiate between the military and the civilians, or between men and women, or adults and children. They threw atomic bombs and used weapons of mass destruction against Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Can the bombs differentiate between the military, women, infants, and children? America has no religion that can deter her from exterminating whole peoples. Your position against Muslims in Palestine is despicable and disgraceful. America has no shame. We believe that the worst thieves in the world today and the worst terrorists are the Americans. Nothing could stop you except perhaps retaliation in kind. So he's basically imitating America. Into his mind, he's saying they do it to us. The only thing that can stop them is doing exactly the same back to them. That's Osama bin Laden's justification, not the Quran, not Islam, not the example of the Prophet Muhammad, but rather he just believes in retaliation and doing what the enemy does do to you. And this is not Islamic at all in the slightest. But this brings us to another question which I raised earlier, which is how does Islam treat non-Muslims? Especially non-Muslims living in Islamic countries or Islamic lands. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he had Jews and Christians, Jews living amongst him, his example was basically an Islamic idea is non-Muslims don't believe in Islam. So you can't apply the Islamic law on them because they don't believe in Islam to follow that law. So Islam came up with an amazing solution to the situation of it gives each people, each group of people, their own law system according to what they believe in. So the Jews had their Jewish law, and the Christians had their Christian law, and the Muslims have Islamic law. And when the Muslims incorporate Christians or Jews into their land, they have a negotiation as to how they would resolve any disputes between their communities. They would negotiate, agree that discussion, make a contract, and then they would live together side by side under true multiculturalism. In the West, you aren't given the right to live under your own law system or the law system of your own community. You are told to live under one law decided by maybe a minority or a majority or one individual, but that law by that minority, which is politicians, or the majority, if it's a pure democracy, which then there is no pure democracy in the world, or there's one individual, it goes to everyone, whether you like it or not, whether you're represented or not. So in France, the Muslims are banned women are banned from wearing hijab. The women in this audience today, you'd be banned from wearing your hijab in schools. And you have to follow that law whether you like it or not. And you have no representation because you are the minority in France, if you were French. But what Islam says is that non-Muslims you cannot force the Sharia upon non-Muslims, even those who are living in the Islamic State. And there's many amazing and quite interesting discussions as to and examples from history. For example, the historian Richard Bulliet, he noted in his book, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, he said, minutely studying case after case, they have shown that justice was generally meted out impartially, irrespective of religion, official status, or gender, and not being subject to the Sharia, Jews and Christians were free to go to their own religious authorities for the adjudication of disputes. But in many cases, they actually went to the Islamic court system, which is obviously voluntary for them. If they want to come to the Islamic law court system, obviously it will serve them. But they had their own law courts, they had their own police, they had their own communities. You see in old Islamic cities, like for example in Damascus, they used to have an old Jewish quarter or an Armenian quarter for the Armenian Christians. In Cairo as well, there was Jewish quarters and there still is Christian quarters, where Christian community could live semi-autonomously. They could live under their own system quite independently. Even in Malaysia, I believe, and Indonesia, they've resurrected this idea for some religious laws, or rather for religious laws that Muslims are obliged to follow. Christians or non-Muslims are exempt from these laws. They don't have to follow these laws. And we see that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ guaranteed rights for non-Muslims. Here's what the Prophet Muhammad said. He said, whoever harms a non-Muslim citizen or imposes upon him more than he can afford, or humiliates him, or takes anything from him without his consent, I will challenge him on the day of judgment. The Prophet Muhammad is warning Muslims that on the day of judgment, he will challenge you before God if you even humiliate a non-Muslim citizen living in an Islamic land. Even for humiliation, forget killing or oppressing or robbing them.